Earlier today on Facebook, we had a comment from William Meyer. He says, we have a well-regulated militia. In fact, we have 50 of them. They're called the National Guard. He was commenting in part of a discussion on some of the posts we made about upcoming fighting rifle classes in Southern California. And so I wrote up a response to him, and then I wanted to share a summary of that with you guys, because I think there's a lot of misconception about this. And as a disclaimer, this is just my opinion. I'm simply one guy who teaches some self-defense and gun classes. You don't have to take my word as gospel. I'm not a civics professor. I'm not a historian. I studied sociology in school, so for what it's worth, I understand a little bit about global politics, but not a whole lot. So take it for what it's worth. See if it makes sense to you. But I have done a lot of reading into this topic, this particular topic here, the role of the armed citizen in the United States, the role of the militia, the definition of the militia, the meaning of the Second Amendment. And so I wanted to share some of this perspective with you guys. And again, take it with a grain of salt, take it for what it's worth. All right. So I think we can agree that the militia was once a very prevalent thing in our country, and because of necessity at the time. And later on, the militia has evolved into various things, such as the law enforcement, fire brigades, EMS systems, search and rescue teams, and the National Guard, right? So the different roles that the militia would take on, as far as being basically just the able-bodied, healthy males of a community, now have become distributed over a lot of professional services, right? That every community now has. So while that is true, that militias evolved into the National Guard, and the National Guard descended from militias, it doesn't mean the National Guard is the militia, and we can look at this by definition. Members of the National Guard, we're talking Army National Guard here, they would go to Army basic training just like a regular soldier in the big Army. They would take orders from the governor. They're deployed and they're equipped by the state, and the state is funded by the federal government. They wear the same uniform as the United States military. They use the same weapons. They receive the same training and equipment, and the governor can sign off orders to send the National Guard. The government can give permission for the president to send the National Guard to foreign wars. And so if you have the National Guard, these soldiers that are able to go into offensive combat in foreign lands, this is way outside the bounds of the role of the militia, right? If there was Katrina, a big hurricane or whatever, and the National Guard is activated to maintain peace in the community, help with the recovery effort, rescue folks who are stranded in the flooding, and deliver dog food to dog shelters. That is the role of the militia, and in that regard, they are the militia. Right? But just be aware that they are not necessarily the same thing. Okay? So when we look at a militia, then what is the militia? What defines the militia? Well, traditional militias are members of the community, and they only work there locally in a defensive capacity only when an emergency appears, and they have no choice but to activate and band together. And so they choose to serve by choice. They're not necessarily paid for their service. And also they're at will. In other words, they could go or they could not go. They could go to a battle or they could not go to the battle. So if we look at times when the American militias were activated, they were all volunteer events. No one was ordered to go. The militias were encouraged to go, and they were all volunteer. And so if they didn't wish to do so, they could just opt out and go home. Oftentimes in a lot of the battles, it was very common for the wives to pack the cartridge box and some bread and cheese or whatever for the militiamen, and they would go and fight a battle, and they'd walk home, and they'd go home for supper. That's not the case anymore if we're talking about the National Guard. Okay, so can individuals that are in the National Guard or in the military or in the law enforcement also choose to be members of the militia? That's a good question, because we have to yet identify militia members are part-time and they're volunteers. So in other words, they all have jobs. If a butcher or a lawyer or a teacher or a painter or a plumber were members of the militia, well, a soldier or policeman could also be a member of the militia. Again, a militia is simply the people. Now, at that time, it was able-bodied males, basically white males at the time. But now it's anybody who's able-bodied: men, women, colored folks, landowners, non-landowners, tenants, everybody, people in our country who could potentially take up arms and engage in conflict for the defense of the community, to maintain stability and peace in our community. They are the militia, and that has nothing to do with gun owners and men and women and politics. It has nothing to do with that. Right? So we have to be clear about our definition, what that means when we have a well-regulated militia. The militia has a role to serve, and it is very closely related to the National Guard, but it is not the same. Members of the National Guard, let's just say, for example, the National Guard was ordered to fire upon protesters, for example. If there was a rioting or whatever, and the National Guard was called to maintain peace and order, and there's protesters throwing Molotov cocktails and sticks and stones, and let's just say there's a National Guardsman that they were tasked with quelling that riot. The National Guard have a choice. They individually have a choice if they want to fire upon their own brethren, their own country people, their own countrymen. And so, yeah, they have a professional duty to maintain peace and order, but if they're ordered to fire upon Americans and they decide that that is an unlawful order, they don't need to obey that order, and they have a right to not obey that order. Or they could have I'm not saying that they should, I'm not saying they shouldn't, I'm just saying everybody's human, and everybody has to look after their own interests, and that's very normal for us. And so if someone who's in service in the military is put in a position where he has to choose between serving his community and serving his family and doing what's best to protect his family and community, or harming his community and family, what do you think this person's loyalties will be? Right? So the National Guard is now filling much of the role of the militia in the regards that the National Guard is very aligned with the militia's motivations. But if at any time the National Guard is employed as agent of the state, and the state's wishes are at odds and not in agreement with the people, just you wait. Plenty of people in the military would defect and go home and pick up arms if necessary, and do what they need to do to protect themselves and their families and their communities, banding together, again, the old-fashioned way. So, or are militias superseded or outdated? Let's move on. I would say no. I would suggest to you that even though we haven't had in our country the necessity to call up the militias in a long time, I would say that the concept is not dead, and that this is a balancing, stabilizing force that just lays low and stays dormant until the need comes for the militias to arise. And that's important. It's not about the armed people running around in the woods that are like right-wing extremists that you see on YouTube documentaries, who call themselves a militia. Those guys, may be so that they're a militia, but they may not represent the core of the population. On the other hand, who is the militia? Normal, good people who don't necessarily want violence, who don't necessarily want to overthrow the government. They just want peace and quiet, and they'll only do violence if they need to, right? So let's move on. There's something you need to know, which is called the Stanford Prison Experiment. This was run by a guy named Stanley Milgram in the 60s, and basically, as a quick synopsis, you have white middle class college boys, and half of them are tasked to be jailers, and half of them are assigned to be inmates. And very quickly, within 2.5 days, the researchers cancel the experiment because they're about to hurt each other, because they're quickly going down the path of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay and the Holocaust, prisoner abuse type stuff. And what this teaches us about our modern society is that we fundamentally don't change as humans.